Chapter 12 of The Eagle's Shadow by James Branch Cabell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Originally recorded by John M. Wilson, released through Bureau 42, donated to LibriVox with his express permission.
12. His back was turned to the door as she entered. He was staring at a picture beside the mantel, a portrait of Frederick R. Woods, and his eyes, when he wheeled about, were wistful. Then on a sudden they lighted up as if they had caught fire from hers, and his adoration flaunted crimson banners in his cheeks, and his heart, I dare say, was a great blaze of happiness. He loved her, you see. When she entered a room, it really made a difference to this absurd young man. He saw a great many lights, for instance, and heard music, and accordingly he laughed now in a very contented fashion. "I wasn't burglarizing," said he. "That is, not exactly. I ought to have asked your permission, I suppose, before coming here, but I couldn't find you, and it was rather important. You see," Mr. Woods continued, pointing to the great carved desk, "I happened to speak of this desk to the Colonel tonight. We were talking of Uncle Fred's death, and I found out, quite by accident, that it hadn't been searched since then. That is, not thoroughly. There are secret drawers, you see. One here," and he touched the spring that threw it open, "and the other on this side. There's nothing of importance in them, only receipted bills and such. The other drawer is inside that center compartment, which is locked. The Colonel wouldn't come. He said it was all foolishness and that he had a book he wanted to read, so he sent me after what he called my mare's nest. It isn't, you see." "No, not quite, Mr. Woods murmured with an odd smile, and then laughed and added lamely, I suppose I'm the only person who knew about it." Mr. Woods's manner was a thought strange. He stammered a little in speaking. He laughed unnecessarily, and Margaret could see that his hands trembled. Taking him all in all, you would have sworn he was repressing some vital emotion, but he did not seem unhappy. No, not exactly unhappy. He was with Margaret, you see. "Oh, you beauty," his meditations ran. He had some excuse. In the soft rosy twilight of the room, the study at Selwood is panelled in very dark oak, and the doors and windows are screened with crimson hangings. Her party-coloured red and yellow gown might have been a scrap of afterglow left over from an unusually fine sunset. In a word, Miss Hugonin was a very quaint and colourful and delectable figure as she came a little further into the room. Her eyes shone like blue stars, and her hair shone, there must be pounds of it, Billy thought, and her very shoulders, plump, flawless, ineffable, shone with the glow of an errant cloud-tatter that is just past the track of dawn, and is therefore neither pink nor white, but somehow manages to combine the best points of both colours. "Ah, indeed," said Miss Hugonin. Her tone imparted a surprising degree of chilliness to this simple remark. "No," she went on, very formally, "this is not a private room. You owe me no apology for being here. Indeed, I am rather obliged to you, Mr. Woods, for none of us knew of those secret drawers. Here is the key to the central compartment, if you'll be kind enough to point out the other one. Dear, dear," Margaret concluded languidly, "all this is quite like a third-rate melodrama. I haven't the least doubt you will discover a will in there in your favour, and be reinstated as the long-lost heir and all that sort of thing. How tiresome that will be for me, though." She was in a mood to be cruel tonight. She held out the keys to him, in a disinterested fashion, and dropped them daintily into his outstretched palm, just as she might have given a coin to an unusually grimy mendicant. But the tips of her fingers grazed his hand. That did the mischief. Her least touch was enough to get every nerve in his body a-tingle. "Peggy," he said hoarsely, as the keys jangled to the floor. Then Mr. Woods drew a little nearer to her and said, "Peggy, Peggy," in a voice that trembled curiously, and appeared to have no intention of saying anything further. Indeed, words would have seemed mere tautology to anyone who could have seen his eyes. Margaret looked into them for a minute, and her own eyes fell before their blaze, and her heart, very foolishly, stood still for a breathing space. Subsequently she recalled the fact that he was a fortune-hunter and that she despised him, and also observed, to her surprise and indignation, that he was holding her hand and had apparently been doing so for some time. You may believe it that she withdrew that pink and white trifle angrily enough. Pray don't be absurd, Mr. Woods, said she. Billy caught up the word. Absurd, he echoed. Yes, that describes what I've been pretty well, doesn't it, Peggy? I was absurd when I let you send me to the right about 4 years ago. I realized that today, the moment I saw you, I should have held on like the very grimmest death. I should have bullied you into marrying me if necessary, and in spite of 50 Anstruthers. Oh yes, I know that now. But I was only a boy then, Peggy, and so I let a boy's pride come between us. I know now there isn't any question of pride where you are concerned. Not any question of pride, nor of any silly misunderstandings, nor of any uncle's wishes, nor of anything but just you, Peggy. It's just you that I care for now. Just you. Ah! Margaret cried, with a swift intake of the breath that was almost a sob. He had dared after all. Oh, it was shameless, sordid, and yet, she thought dimly, how dear that little quiver in his voice had been were it unplanned, and how she could have loved this big, eager boy, were he not the hypocrite she knew him. She'd show him. But somehow, though it was manifestly what he deserved, she found she couldn't look him in the face while she did it. So she dropped her eyes to the floor and waited for a moment of tense silence. Then, am I to consider this a proposal, Mr. Woods? She asked, in muffled tones. Billy stared. Yes, said he, very gravely after an interval. You see, she explained, still in the same dull voice, you phrased it so vaguely I couldn't well be certain. You don't propose very well, Mr. Woods. I've had opportunities to become an authority on such matters, you see, since I've been rich. That makes a difference, doesn't it? A great many men are willing to marry me, now, who wouldn't have thought of such a thing, say 4 years ago. So I've had some experience. Oh yes, three persons have offered to marry me for my money earlier in this very evening, before you did, Mr. Woods. And really I can't compliment you on your methods, Mr. Woods. They are a little vague, a little abrupt, a little transparent, don't you think? Peggy, he cried, in a frightened whisper. He could not believe, you see, that it was the woman he loved who was speaking, and for my part I admit frankly that at this very point, if ever in her life, Margaret deserved a thorough shaking. Dear me, she airily observed, I'm sure I've said nothing out of the way. I think it speaks very well for you that you're so fond of your old home, so anxious to regain it at any cost. It's quite touching, Mr. Woods. She raised her eyes toward his. I dare say she was suffering as much as he. But women consider it a point of honor to smile when they stab. Margaret smiled with an innocence that would have seemed overdone in an angel. Then, in an instant, she had the grace to be abjectly ashamed of herself. Billy's face had gone white. His mouth was set mask-like, and his breathing was a little perfunctory. It stung her, though, that he was not angry. He was sorry. I see, he said very carefully. You think I want the money. Yes, I see. And why not? She queried pleasantly. Dear me, money is a very sensible thing to want, I'm sure. It makes a great difference, you know. He looked down into her face for a moment. One might have sworn this detected fortune-hunter pitied her. Yes, he assented slowly. It makes a difference. Not a difference for the better, I'm afraid, Peggy. Ensued a silence. Then Margaret tossed her head. She was fast losing her composure. She would have given the world to retract what she had said, and accordingly she resolved to brazen it out. You needn't look at me as if I were a convicted criminal, she said sharply. I won't marry you, and there's an end of it. It isn't that I'm thinking of, said Mr. Woods, with a grave smile. You see, it takes me a little time to realize your honest opinion of me. I believe I understand now. You think me a very hopeless cad. That's about your real opinion, isn't it, Peggy? I didn't know that, you see. I thought you knew me better than that. You did once, Peggy. Once a long time ago, and I hoped you hadn't quite forgotten that time. The allusion was ill chosen. Oh, she cried, gasping. You! To remind me of that time! You of all men! Haven't you a vestige of shame? Haven't you a rag of honor left? Oh, I didn't know there were such men in the world. And to think, Margaret's glorious voice broke, and she wrung her hands helplessly. Then, after a little, she raised her eyes to his, and spoke without a trace of emotion. "To think," she said, and her voice was toneless now, "to think that I loved you. It's that hurts, you know. For I loved you very dearly, Billy Woods. Yes, I think I loved you quite as much as any woman has ever loved a man. You were the first, you see, and girls are very foolish about such things. I thought you were brave, and strong, and clean, and honest, and beautiful, and dear. Oh, quite the best and dearest man in the world, I thought you, Billy Woods. That was queer, wasn't it?" she asked, with a listless little shiver. "Yes, it was very queer. You didn't think of me in quite that way, did you? No, you thought I was well enough to amuse you for a while. I was well enough for a summer flirtation, wasn't I, Billy? But marriage! Oh, no, you never thought of marriage then. You ran away when Uncle Fred suggested that. You refused point blank, refused in this very room, didn't you, Billy? Ah, that hurt," Margaret ended, with a faint smile. "Yes, it hurt." Billy Woods raised a protesting hand, as though to speak, but afterward he drew a deep, tremulous breath, and bit his lip, and was silent. She had spoken very quietly, very simply, very like a tired child. Now her voice lifted. "But you've hurt me more tonight," she said equably. "Tonight, when you've come cringing back to me whom you'd have none of when I was poor. I'm rich now, though. That makes a difference, doesn't it, Billy? You're willing to whistle back the girl's love you flung away once. Yes, quite willing. But can't you understand how much it must hurt me to think I ever loved you?" Margaret asked very gently. She wanted him to understand. She wanted him to be ashamed. She prayed God that he might be just a little bit ashamed, so that she might be able to forgive him. But he stood silent, bending puzzled brows toward her. "Can't you understand, Billy?" she pleaded softly. "I can't help seeing what a cur you are. I must hate you, Billy, of course I must," she insisted very gently, as though arguing the matter with herself. Then suddenly she sobbed and wrung her hands in anguish. "Oh, I can't, she wailed. "God help me, I can't hate you, even though I know you for what you are." His arms lifted a little, and in a flash Margaret knew that what she most wanted in all the world was to have them close about her, and then to lay her head upon his shoulder and cry contentedly. Oh, she did want to forgive him. If he had lost all sense of shame, why could he not lie to her? Surely he could at least lie. And oh, how gladly she would believe only the tiniest, the flimsiest fiction her eyes craved of him. But he merely said, I see, very slowly, and then smiled. "We'll put the money aside just now," he said. "Perhaps after a little we'll come back to that. I think you've forgotten, though, that when Uncle Fred and I had our difference, you had just thrown me over, had just ordered me never to speak to you again. I couldn't very well ask you to marry me, could I? Under those circumstances?" "I spoke in a moment of irritation," a very dignified Margaret pointed out. "You would have paid no attention whatever to it if you had really cared." Billy laughed rather sadly. "Oh, I cared right enough," he said. "I still care. The question is, do you?" "No," said Margaret, with decision. "I don't. Not in the least." "Peggy," Mr. Woods commanded, "look at me." "You have had your answer, I think," Miss Hugonin indifferently observed. Billy caught her chin in his hand and turned her face to his. "Peggy, do you care?" he asked softly. And Margaret looked into his honest-seeming eyes and, in a panic, knew that her traitor lips were forming, "Yes." "That would be rather unfortunate, wouldn't it?" she asked with a smile. "You see, it was only an hour ago I promised to marry Mr. Canaston." "Canaston!" Billy gasped. You don't mean that you care for him, Peggy?" "I really can't see why it should concern you," said Margaret sweetly. "But since you ask, I do." "You couldn't expect me to remain inconsolable forever, you know." Then the room blurred before her eyes. She stood rigid, defiant. She was dimly aware that Billy was speaking from a great distance, it seemed, and that after a century or two his face came back to her out of the whirl of the things. And though she did not know it, they were smiling bravely at one another. "And so," Mr. Woods was stating, "I've been an even greater ass than usual, and I hope you'll be very, very happy." "Thank you," she returned mechanically. I hope so. After an interval, "Good night, Peggy," said Mr. Woods. "Oh, good night," said she with a start. He turned to go. Then, "By Jove," said he grimly, "I've been so busy making an ass of myself I've forgotten all about more important things." Mr. Woods picked up the keys and, going to the desk, unlocked the center compartment with a jerk. Afterward he gave a sharp exclamation. He had found a paper in the secret drawer at the back which appeared to startle him. Billy unfolded it slowly, with a puzzled look growing in his countenance. Then for a moment Margaret's golden head drew close to his yellow curls, and they read it through together. And in the most melodramatic and improbable fashion in the world, they found it to be the last will and testament of Frederick R. Woods. But I don't understand," was Miss Hugonen's awed comment. "It's exactly like the other will, only, why, it's dated the 17th of June, the day before he died, and it's witnessed by Hodges and Burton, the butler, and the first footman, you know, and they've never said anything about such a paper. And then, why should he have made another will just like the first?" Billy pondered. "By and by, I think I can explain that," he said, in a rather peculiar voice. "You see, Hodges and Burton witnessed all his papers, half the time without knowing what they were about. They would hardly have thought of this particular one after his death, and it isn't quite the same will as the other. It leaves you practically everything, but it doesn't appoint any trustees as the other did, because this will was drawn up after you were of age. Moreover, it contains these 4 bequests to colleges, to establish a Woods Chair of Ethnology, which the other will didn't provide for. Of course, it would have been simpler merely to add a codicil to the first will, but Uncle Fred was always very methodical. I think he was probably going through the desk the night he died, destroying various papers. He must have taken the other will out to destroy it just before he died. Perhaps... Billy paused for a little and then laughed unmirthfully. "It scarcely matters," said he. "Here is the will. It is undoubtedly genuine and undoubtedly the last he made. You'll have to have it probated, Peggy, and settled with the colleges. It won't make much of a hole in the Woods millions." There was a half-humorous bitterness in his voice that Margaret noted silently. So, she thought, he had hoped for a moment that at the last Frederick R. Woods had relented toward him. It grieved her, in a dull fashion, to see him so mercenary. It grieved her, though she would have denied it emphatically, to see him so disappointed. Since he wanted the money so much, she would have liked for him to have had it, worthless as he was, for the sake of the boy he had been. "Thank you," she said coldly as she took the paper. "I will give it to my father. He will do what is necessary. Good night, Mr. Woods." Then she locked up the desk in a businesslike fashion and turned to him and held out her hand. "Good night, Billy," said this perfectly inconsistent young woman. "For a moment I thought Uncle Fred had altered his will in your favor. I almost wish he had." Billy smiled a little. "That would never have done," he said gravely as he shook hands. "You forget what a sordid and heartless and generally good-for-nothing chap I am, Peggy. It's much better as it is." Only the tiniest, the flimsiest fiction her eyes craved of him. "Even now at the 11th hour, lie to me, Billy Woods, and oh, how gladly I'll believe." But he merely said, "Good night, Peggy," and went out of the room. His broad shoulders had a pathetic droop, a listlessness. Margaret was glad. Of course she was glad. At last she had told him exactly what she had thought of him. Why shouldn't she be glad? She was delighted. So by way of expressing this delight, she sat down at the desk and began to cry, very softly. 13. Having duly considered the emptiness of existence, the unworthiness of men, the dreary future that awaited her, though this did not trouble her greatly, as she confidently expected to die soon, and many other such dolorous topics, Miss Hugonen decided to retire for the night. She rose, filled with speculations as to the paltriness of life and the probability of her eyes being red in the morning. "It'll be all his fault if they are," she consoled herself. "Doubtless he'll be very much pleased. After robbing me of all faith in humanity, I dare say the one thing needed to complete his happiness is to make me look like a fright. I hate him. After making me miserable now, I suppose he'll go off and make some other woman miserable. Oh, of course he'll make love to the first woman he meets who has any money. I'm sure she's welcome to him. I only pity any woman who has to put up with him. No, I don't," Margaret decided after reflection. "I hate her, too." Miss Hugonen went to the door leading to the hallway and paused. Then, I grieve to relate it, She shook a little pink-tipped fist in the air. "I detest you," she commented between her teeth. "Oh, how dare you make me feel so ashamed of the way I've treated you?" The query, as possibly you may have divined, was addressed to Mr. Woods. He was standing by the fireplace in the hallway, and his tall figure was outlined sharply against the flame of the gas logs that burned there. His shoulders had a pathetic droop, a listlessness. Billy was reading a paper of some kind by the firelight, and the black outline of his face smiled grimly over it. Then he laughed and threw it into the fire. "Billy," a voice observed, a voice that was honey and gold and velvet and all that is most sweet and rich and soft in the world. Mr. Woods was aware of a light step, a swishing, sibilant, delightful rustling. The caress of sound is the rustling of a well-groomed woman's skirts, and of an afterthought of violets, of a mere reminiscence of orris, all of which came toward him through the dimness of the hall. He started, noticeably. "Billy," Miss Hugonin stated, "I'm sorry for what I said to you. I'm not sure it isn't true, you know, but I'm sorry I said it." "Bless your heart," said Billy. "Don't you worry over that, Peggy, that's all right. Incidentally, the things you've said to me and about me aren't true, of course. But we won't discuss that just now. I fancy we're both feeling a bit fagged. Go to bed, Peggy. We'll both go to bed, and the night will bring counsel, and we'll sleep off all unkindliness. Go to bed, little sister. Get all the beauty sleep you want and the least in need of, and dream of how happy you're going to be with the man you love, and in the morning I may have something to say to you. Good night, dear." And this time he really went. And when he had come to the bend in the stairs, his eyes turned back to hers, slowly and irresistibly drawn toward them, as it seemed, just as the sunflower is drawn toward the sun, or the needle toward the pole, or, in fine, as the eyes of young gentlemen ordinarily are drawn toward the eyes of the one woman in the world. Then he disappeared. The mummery of it vexed Margaret. There was no excuse for his looking at her in that way. It irritated her. She was almost as angry with him for doing it as she would have been for not doing it. Therefore she bent an angry face toward the fire, her mouth pouting in a rather inviting fashion. Then it rounded slowly into a sanguine "oh," which of itself suggested osculation, but in reality stood for observe. For the paper Billy had thrown into the fire had fallen under the gas logs, and she remembered his guilty start. "After all," said Margaret, "it's none of my business." So she eyed it wistfully. "It may be important," she considerately remembered. "It ought not to be left there." So she fished it out with a big paper cutter. "But it can't be very important," she dissented afterward, "or he wouldn't have thrown it away." So she looked at the superscripture on the back of it. Then she gave a little gasp and tore it open and read it by the firelight. Miss Hugonin subsequently took credit to herself for not going into hysterics. And I think she had some reason to, for she found the paper a duplicate of the one Billy had taken out of the secret drawer, with his name set in the place of hers. At the last, Frederick R. Woods had relented toward his nephew. Margaret laughed a little, then she cried a little, then she did both together. Afterward she sat in the firelight very puzzled and very excited and very penitent and very beautiful, and was happier than she had ever been in her life. "He had it in his pocket," her dear voice quavered. "He had it in his pocket. My brave, strong, beautiful Billy did when he asked me to marry him. It was King Cophetua wooing the beggar maid, and the beggar was an impudent, ungrateful, idiotic little piece," Margaret hissed in her most shrewish manner. "She ought to be spanked. She ought to go down on her knees to him, in sackcloth and tears and ashes and all sorts of penitential things. She will, too. Oh, it's such a beautiful world, such a beautiful world. Billy loves me, really. Billy's a millionaire, and I'm a pauper. Oh, I'm glad, glad, glad." She caressed the paper that had rendered the world such a goodly place to live in, caressed it tenderly and rubbed her cheek against it. That was Margaret's way of showing affection, you know. And I protest it must have been very pleasant for the paper. The only wonder was that the ink it was written in didn't turn red with delight. Then she read it through again, for sheer enjoyment of those beautiful, incomprehensible words that disinherited her. How lovely of Uncle Fred, she thought. Of course he'd forgiven Billy. Who wouldn't? What beautiful language Uncle Fred used. Quite prayer-booky, she termed it. Then she gasped. The will in Billy's favor was dated a week earlier. than the one they had found in the secret drawer. It was worthless. Mere waste paper. At the last, Frederick R. Woods's pride had conquered his love. "Oh, the horrid old man!" Margaret wailed. "He's left me everything he had. How dare he disinherit Billy? I call it rank impertinence in him. Oh, boy dear, dear, dear boy," Miss Hugonin crooned, in an ecstasy of tenderness and woe. "He found this first will in one of the other drawers, and thought he was the rich one, and came in a great whirl of joy to ask me to marry him, and I was horrid to him. Oh, what a mess I've made of it! I've called him a fortune hunter, and I've told him I love another man, and he'll never, never ask me to marry him now. And I love him, I worship him, I adore him, and if only I were poor—" Ensued a silence. Margaret lifted the 2 wills, scrutinized them closely, and then looked at the fire, interrogatively. "It's penal servitude for quite a number of years," she said. "But then he really couldn't tell anyone, you know. No gentleman would allow a lady to be locked up in jail. And if he knew I didn't and couldn't consider him a fortune hunter, I really believe he would." Whatever she believed he would do, the probability of his doing it seemed very highly agreeable to Miss Hugonin. She smiled at the fire in the most friendly fashion, and held out one of the folded papers to it. "Yes," said Margaret, "I'm quite sure he will. There I think we may leave her, for I have dredged the dictionary, and I confess I have found no fitting words wherewith to picture this inconsistent, impulsive, adorable young woman, dreaming brave dreams in the firelight of her lover, and of their united future. I should only bungle it. You must imagine it for yourself. It is a pretty picture, is it not? With its laughable side, perhaps, under the circumstances whimsical, if you will, but very, very sacred. For she loved him with a clean heart, loved him infinitely. Let us smile at it, tenderly, and pass on. But upon my word, when I think of how unreasonably, how outrageously Margaret had behaved during the entire evening, I am tempted to depose her as our heroine. I begin to regret I had not selected Adele Hackage. She would have done admirably, for, depend upon it, she too had her trepidations, her white knights, her occult battles over Hugh Van Orden. Also, she was a pretty girl, if you care for brunettes, and accomplished. She was versed in I forget how many foreign languages, both continental and dead, and could discourse sensibly in any one of them. She was perfectly reasonable, perfectly consistent, perfectly unimpulsive, and never expressed an opinion that was not countenanced by at least 2 competent authorities. I don't know a man living prepared to dispute that Miss Haggage excelled Miss Hugonin in all their desirable qualities. Yet with pleasing unanimity they went mad for Margaret, and had the greatest possible respect for Adele. And, my dear Mrs. Grundy, I grant you cheerfully that this was all wrong. A sensible man, as you very justly observe, will seek in a woman something more enduring than mere personal attractions. He will value her for some sensible reason, say for her wit, or her learning, or her skill in cookery, or her proficiency in Greek. A sensible man will look for a sensible woman. He will not concern his sensible head over such trumperies as a pair of bright eyes, or a red lip or so, or a satisfactory suit of hair. These are fleeting vanities. However, you have doubtless heard ere this, my dear madam, that had Cleopatra's nose been an inch shorter, the destiny of the world would have been changed. Had she been the woman you describe, perfectly reasonable, perfectly consistent, perfectly sensible in all she said and did, confess, dear lady, wouldn't Antony have taken to his heels and fled from such a monster? 14. I regret to admit that Mr. Woods did not toss feverishly about his bed all through the silent watches of the night. He was very miserable, but he was also 26. That is an age when the blind bow-god deals no fatal wounds. It is an age to suffer poignantly, if you will, an age wherein to aspire to the dearest woman on earth, to write her halting verses, to lose her, to affect the clichés of cynicism, to hear the chimes of midnight, and after it all, to sleep like a top. So Billy slept, and kind Hypnos loosed a dream through the gates of ivory that lifted him to a delectable land where Peggy was 19 and had never heard of Canaston, and was unbelievably sweet and dear and beautiful. But presently they and the colonel put forth to sea on a great carved writing desk, fishing for sharks, which the colonel said were very plentiful in those waters. And Frederick R. Woods climbed up out of the sea and said Billy was a fool and must go to college, and Peggy said that was impossible, as 1,750,000 children had to be given an education apiece, and they couldn't spare one for Billy. And a missionary from Zambezi land came out of one of the secret drawers and said Billy must give him both of his feet, as he needed them for his working girls' classes. And thereupon the sharks poked their heads out of the water and began in a deafening chorus to cry, "Feet, feet, feet!" And Billy then woke with a start and found it was only the birds chattering in the dawn outside. Then he was miserable. He tossed and groaned and dozed and smoked cigarettes until he could stand it no longer. He got up and dressed in sheer desperation and went for a walk in the gardens. The day was clear as a new minted coin. It was not yet wholly aired, not wholly free from the damp savour of night, but low in the east the sun was taking heart. A mile-long shadow footed in with Billy in his pacings through the amber-checkered gardens. Actaeon-like, he surprised the world at its toilet, and its fleeting grace somewhat fortified his spirits. But his thoughts pestered him like gnats. The things he said to the roses, it is not necessary to write down.
End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Eagle's Shadow by James Branch Cabell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Originally recorded by John M. Wilson for Bureau 42, donated to LibriVox with his express permission.
15. After a vituperative half-hour or so, Mr. Woods was hungry. He came back towards Selwood, and upon the terrace in front of the house he found Kathleen Saumarez. During the warm weather, one corner of the terrace had been converted by means of gay red and white awnings into a sort of living room. There were chairs, tables, sofa cushions, bowls of roses, and any number of bright-coloured rugs. Altogether it was a cosy place, and the glowing hues of its furnishings were very becoming to Mrs. Saumarez, who sat there writing industriously. It was a thought embarrassing. They had avoided one another yesterday, rather obviously, both striving to put off a necessary awkward meeting. Now it had come, and now somehow their eyes met for a moment, and they laughed frankly, and the awkwardness was gone. "Kathleen," said Mr. Woods with conviction, "you're a dear." "You broke my heart," said she demurely, "but I'm going to forgive you." Mrs. Saumarez was not striving to be clever now, and heavens, thought Billy, how much nicer she was like this. Wasn't the same woman. Her thin cheeks flushed arbutus-like, and her rather metallic voice was grown low and gentle. Billy brought memories with him, you see, and for the moment she was Kathleen Epps again. Kathleen Epps in the first flush of youth, eager, trustful, and joyous-hearted, as he had known her long ago. Since then the poor woman had eaten of the bread of dependence, and had found it salt enough. She had paid for it daily, enduring 1,000 petty slights, 1,000 petty insults, and smiling under them as only women can. But she had forgotten now that shrewd Kathleen Saumarez, who must earn her livelihood as best she might. She smiled frankly, a purely unprofessional smile. "I was sorry when I heard you were coming," she said irrelevantly, "but I'm glad now." Mr. Woods, I grieve to relate, was still holding her hand in his. There stirred in his pulses the thrill Kathleen Epps had always wakened. A thrill of memory now, a mere wraith of emotion. He was thinking of a certain pink-cheeked girl with crinkly black-brown hair and eyes that he had likened to chrysoberyls, and he wondered whimsically what had become of her. This was not she. This was assuredly not Kathleen, for this woman had a large mouth, a humorous and kindly mouth, it was true, but undeniably a large one, whereas Kathleen's mouth had been quite perfect, and rather diminutive than otherwise. Hadn't he rhymed of it often enough to know? They stood gazing at one another for a long time, and in the back of Billy's brain lines of his old verses sang themselves to a sad little tune. The verses that reproved the idiocy of all other poets, who had very foolishly written their sonnets to other women. And yet, as the jingle pointed out, had these poets ever strayed in thy path, they had not made random rhymes of Arabella, songs of Dolly, hymns of Stella, lades of Lalage or Chloris, not of Daphne nor of Doris, Florimel nor Amaryllis, nor of Phillida nor Phyllis, were their wanton melodies. But all of these, all their melodies had been of thee, Kathleen. Would they had been? Billy thought it improbable. The verses were very silly. and recalling the big, blundering boy who had written them, Billy began to wonder, somewhat forlornly, whether he, too, had vanished. He and the girl he had gone mad for both seemed rather mythical, legendary as King Pepin. "Yes," said Mrs. Saumarez. And oh, she startled him. "I fancy they're both quite dead by now, Billy," she cried earnestly. "Don't laugh at them. Don't laugh at those dear, foolish children. Somehow I couldn't bear that, Billy." "Kathleen," said Mr. Woods in admiration, "you're a witch." "I wasn't laughing, though, my dear. I was developing quite a twilight mood over them. A plaintive, old-lettery sort of mood, you know." She sighed a little. "Yes, I know." Then her eyelids flickered in a parody of Kathleen's glance that Billy noted with a queer tenderness. "Come and talk to me, Billy," she commanded. "I'm an early bird this morning, and entitled to the very biggest and best-looking worm I can find. You're only a worm, you know. We're all worms. Mr. Jukesbury told me so last night, making an exception in my favour, for it appears I'm an angel. He was amorously inclined last night, the tipsy old fraud. It's shameless, Billy, the amount of money he gets out of Miss Hugonin for the deserving poor. Do you know, I rather fancy he classes himself under that head? And I grant you he's poor enough. But deserving?" Mrs. Saumarez snapped her fingers eloquently. Shark, queried Mr. Woods, in some discomfort. She nodded. "He is as bad as Sarah Haggage," she informed him, "and everybody knows what a bloodsucker she is. The haggage is a disease, Billy, that all witch women are exposed to, more easily caught than the pestilence, and the taker runs presently mad. Depend upon it, Billy, those two will have every penny they can get out of your uncle's money." "Peggy's so generous," he pleaded. "She wants to make everybody happy, bring about a general millennium, you know." "She pays dearly enough for her fancies," said Miss Saumarez, in a hard voice. Then, after a little, she cried suddenly, "Oh, Billy, Billy, it shames me to think of how we lie to her, and toady to her, and lead her on from one mad scheme to another, all for the sake of the money we can pilfer incidentally. We're all arrant hypocrites, you know. I'm no better than the others, Billy, not a bit better, but my husband left me so poor, and I had always been accustomed to the pretty things of life, and I couldn't give them up, Billy. I love them too dearly, so I'd lie and toady and write drivelling talks about things I don't understand for drivelling women to listen to, and I still have the creature comforts of life. I pawned my self-respect for them, that's all. Such a little price to pay, isn't it, Billy?" She spoke in a sort of frenzy. I dare say that at the onset she wanted Mr. Woods to know the worst of her, knowing he could not fail to discover it in time. Billy brought memories with him, you see, and this shrewd, hard woman wanted somehow, more than anything else in the world, that he should think well of her. So she babbled out the whole pitiful story, waiting in a kind of terror to see contempt and disgust awaken in his eyes. But he merely said, I see, very slowly, and his eyes were kindly. He couldn't be angry with her somehow. That pink-cheeked, crinkly-haired girl stood between them and shielded her. He was only very, very sorry. "And Kynaston?" he asked after a little. Mrs. Saumarez flushed. "Mr. Kynaston is a man of great genius," she said quickly. "Of course Miss Hugonin is glad to assist him in publishing his books. It's an honor to her that he permits it. They have to be published privately, you know, as the general public isn't capable of appreciating such dainty little masterpieces. Oh, don't make any mistake, Billy. Mr. Kynaston is a very wonderful and very admirable man." Yes. He struck me as being an unusually nice chap," said Mr. Woods untruthfully. "I dare say they'll be very happy." "Who?" Mrs. Saumarez demanded. "Why, I don't suppose they'll make any secret of it," Billy stammered in tardy repentance of his hasty speaking. "Peggy told me last night she had accepted him." Mrs. Saumarez turned to rearrange a bowl of roses. She seemed to have some difficulty over it. "Billy," she spoke inconsequently, and with averted head, "an honest man is the noblest work of God, and the rarest." Billy groaned. "Do you know," said he, "I've just been telling the roses in the gardens yonder the same thing about women. I am a misogynist this morning. I have decided no woman is truly worthy of being loved." "That is quite true," she assented. "But on the other hand, no man is worthy of loving." Billy smiled. "I have likewise come to the conclusion," said he, "that a man's love is like his hat, in that any peg will do to hang it on. Also, in that the proper and best place for it is on his own head. Oh, I assure you, I've vented any number of cheap cynicisms on the helpless roses. And yet, will you believe it, Kathleen, it doesn't seem to make me feel a bit better. No, not a bit. It's very like his hat, she declared, and that he has a new one every year. Then she rested her hand on his in a half-maternal fashion. What's the matter, boy? She asked softly. You're always so fresh and wholesome. I don't like to see you like this. Better leave phrase-making to us phrasemongers. Her voice rang true and compassionate, and tender, and all that a woman's voice should be. Billy could not but trust her. I've been an ass, said he, rather tragically. Oh, not an unusual ass, Kathleen, just the sort men are always making of themselves. You see, before I went to France, there was a girl I cared for, and I let a quarrel come between us. A foolish, trifling, idle little quarrel, Kathleen, that we might have made up in a half-hour. But I was too proud, you see. No, I wasn't proud either, Mr. Woods amended bitterly. I was simply pig-headed and mulish. So I went away, and yesterday I saw her again and realized that I still cared. That's all, Kathleen. It isn't an unusual story. And Mr. Woods laughed mirthlessly and took a turn on the terrace. Mrs. Salmarez was regarding him intently. Her cheeks were of a deeper, more attentive pink, and her breath came and went quickly. I don't understand, said she in a rather queer voice. Oh, it's simple enough, Billy assured her. You see, well, I think she would have married me once. Yes, she cared for me once, and I quarreled with her. I, conceited young ass that I was, actually presumed to dictate to the dearest, sweetest, most lovable woman on earth, and tell her what she must do and what she mustn't. I, good Lord, I, who wasn't worthy to sweep a crossing clean for her, who wasn't worthy to breathe the same air with her, who wasn't worthy to exist in the same world she honored by living in. Oh, I was an ass. But I've paid for it. Oh, yes, Kathleen, I've paid dearly for it, and I'll pay more dearly yet before I've done. I tried to avoid her yesterday, you must have seen that, and I couldn't. I give you my word I could no more have kept away from her than I could have spread a pair of wings and flown away. She doesn't care a bit for me now, but I can no more give up loving her than I can give up eating my dinner. That isn't a pretty simile, Kathleen, but it expresses the way I feel toward her. It isn't merely that I want her, it's more than that, oh, far more than that. I simply can't do without her. Don't you understand, Kathleen? He asked desperately. Yes, I think I understand, she said when he had ended. Oh, Billy, I am almost sorry. It's dear of you, Billy, to care for me still, but I'm almost sorry you care so much. I'm not worth it, boy dear, and I really don't know what to say. You must let me think. Mr. Woods gave an inarticulate sound. The face she turned to him was perplexed, half sad, fond, a little pleased, and strangely compassionate. It was Kathleen Epps who sat beside him. The 6 years were as utterly forgotten as the name of Magdalen's first lover. She was a girl again, listening, with a heart that fluttered, I dare say, to the wild talk, the mad dithyrambics of a big blundering boy. The ludicrous horror of it stunned Mr. Woods. He could no more have told her of her mistake than he could have struck her in the face. Kathleen, said he vaguely, let me think. Oh, let me think, Billy, she pleaded in a flutter of joy and amazement. Go away, boy dear. Go away for a little, let me think. I'm not an emotional woman, but I'm on the verge of hysterics now for several reasons. Go in to breakfast, Billy. I want to be alone. You've made me very proud and sorry, I think, and glad and oh, I don't know, boy dear. But please go now, please. Billy went. In the living hall he paused to inspect a picture with peculiar interest. Since Kathleen cared for him, he thought rather forlornly, he must perjure himself in as plausible a manner as might be possible. Please God, having done what he had done, he would lie to her like a gentleman and try to make her happy. A vision in incredible violet ruffles coming down to breakfast saw him and paused on the stairway and flushed and laughed deliciously. Poor Billy stared at her, and his heart gave a great bound, and then appeared to stop for an indefinite time. Good Lord, said Mr. Woods in his soul, and I thought I was an ass last night. Why, last night in comparison I displayed intelligence that was almost human. Oh, Peggy, Peggy, if I only dared tell you what I think of you, I believe I would gladly die afterward. Yes, I'm sure I would. You really haven't any right to be so beautiful. It isn't fair to us, Peggy." But the vision was peeping over the banisters at him, and the vision's eyes were sparkling with a lucent mischief, and a wonderful half-hushed contralto was demanding of him, "Oh, where have you been, Billy boy, Billy boy? Oh, where have you been, charming Billy?" And Billy's baritone answered her, "I've been to seek a wife," and broke off in a groan. "Good Lord!" cried Mr. Woods. It was a ludicrous business, if you will. Indeed, it was vastly humorous, was it not, this woman's thinking a man's love might by any chance endure through 6 whole years? But their love endures, you see, and the silly creatures have a superstition among them that love is a sacred thing, stronger than time, victorious over death itself. Let us laugh, then, at Kathleen Saumarez. Those of us who have learned that love is only a tinkling cymbal, and faith a sounding brass, and fidelity an obsolete affectation. But for my part I honor and think better of the woman, who through all her struggles with the world, through all those sordid, grim, merciless, secret battles where the vanquished may not even cry for succor, I honor her, I say, for that she had yet cherished the memory of that first love, which is the best and purest and most unselfish and most excellent thing in life. 16. Breakfast Margaret enjoyed hugely. I regret to confess that the fact that every one of her guests was more or less miserable moved this hard-hearted young woman to untimely and excessive mirth. Only Mrs. Saumarez puzzled her, for she could think of no reason for that lady's manifest agitation when Kathleen eventually joined the others. But for the rest, the hopeless glances that Hugh Van Orden cast toward her caused Adele to flush, and Mrs. Huggins to become despondent and speechless and astonishingly rigid. And Petheridge Jewkesbury's vaguely apologetic attitude toward the world struck Miss Hugonin as infinitely diverting. Canaston she pitied a little, but his bearing toward her ranged ludicrously from that of proprietorship to that of supplication, and moreover she was furious with him for having hinted at various times that Billy was a fortune-hunter. Margaret was quite confident by this that she had never believed him. Not really, you know, having argued the point out at some length the night before, and reaching her conclusion by a course of reasoning peculiar to herself. Mr. Woods, as you may readily conceive, was sunk in the slough of despond deeper than ever plummet sounded. Margaret thought this very nice of him. It was a delicate tribute to her that he ate nothing, and the fact that Hugh Van Orden and Petheridge Jewkesbury, as she believed, acted in precisely the same way for precisely the same reason, merely demonstrated, of course, that her overwhelming conceit and presumption. So, sitting in the great eagle's shadow, she ate a quantity of marmalade, she was wont to begin the day in this ungodly English fashion, and gossiped like a brook trotting over sunlit pebbles. She had planned a pulverizing surprise for the house party, and in due time she intended to explode it, and subsequently Billy was to apologize for his conduct, and then they were to live happily ever afterward. She had not yet decided what he was to apologize for. That was his affair. His conscience ought to have told him by this wherein he had offended, and if his conscience hadn't, why then of course he would have to apologize for his lack of proper sensibility. After breakfast she went, according to her usual custom, to her father's rooms, for, as I think I have told you, the old gentleman was never visible until noon. She had astonishing news for him. What time she divulged it, the others sat on the terrace, and Mr. Canaston read to them, as he had promised, from his Defence of Ignorance. It proved a welcome diversion to more than one of the party. Mr. Woods especially esteemed it a godsend. It staved off misfortune for at least a little, so he sat at Kathleen's side in silence, trying desperately to be happy, trying desperately not to see the tiny wrinkles, the faint crow's feet time had sketched in her face, as a memorandum of the work he meant to do shortly. Billy consoled himself with the reflection that he was very fond of her, but, oh, he thought what worship, what adoration he could accord this woman if she would only decline, positively, to have anything whatever to do with him. I think we ought not to miss hearing Mr. Canaston's discourse. It is generally conceded that his style is wonderfully clever, and I have no doubt that his detractors, who complain that his style is mere word-twisting, a mere inversion of the most ancient truisms, are actuated by the very basest jealousy. Let us listen then, and be duly edified as he reads in a low, sweet voice, and the birds twitter about him in the clear morning. "It has been for many years," Mr. Kynaston began, "the custom of patriotic gentlemen, in quest of office, to point with pride to the fact that the schoolmaster is abroad in the land, in whose defence they stand pledged to draw their salaries and fight to the last gasp for re-election. These lofty platitudes, while trying to the lungs, doubtless appeal to a certain class of minds. But indeed the schoolmaster is not abroad. He is domesticated in every village in America, where each hamlet has its would-be Shakespeare, and each would-be Shakespeare has his Hamlet by heart. Learning is rampant in the land, and valuable information is pasted up in the streetcars, so that he who rides may read. And ignorance, beautiful divine ignorance, is forsaken by a generation that clamors for the truth. And what value, pray, has this truth, that we should lust after it?" He glanced up in an inquiring fashion. Mr. Jewkesbury, meeting his eyes, smiled and shook his head and said, "Fie, fie," very placidly. To do him justice, he had not the least idea what Kynaston was talking about. "I am aware," the poet continued with an air of generosity, "that many pleasant things have been said of it. In fact, our decade has turned its back relentlessly upon the decayed, and we no longer read the lament over the lost art of lying, issued many magazines ago by a once prominent British author. Still, without advancing any wild theories, one may fairly claim that truth is a jewel with many facets, differing in appearance from each point of view. And while tell the truth and shame the devil is a very pretty sentiment, it need not necessarily mean anything. The devil, if there be a personal devil, and it has been pointed out, with some show of reason, that an impersonal one could scarcely carry out such enormous contracts, would in all probability rather approve than otherwise of indiscriminate truth-telling. Irritation is the root of all evil, and there is nothing more irritating than to hear the truth about oneself. It is bad enough, in all conscience, to be insulted, but the truth of an insult is the barb that prevents its retraction. Truth hurts, has all the pathos of understatement. It not only hurts, but infuriates. It has no more right to go naked in public than anyone else. Indeed, it has less right, for truth-telling is natural to mankind, as is shown by its prevalence among the younger sort, such as children and cynics. And as Shakespeare long ago forgot to tell us, a touch of nature makes the whole world embarrassed. At this point Mrs. Haggage sniffed. She considered he was growing improper. She distrusted nature. Truth-telling, then, may safely be regarded as an unamiable indiscretion. In art, the bare truth must, in common gallantry, be awarded a print petticoat, or one of canvas, as the case may be, to hide her nakedness. And in life it is a disastrous virtue that we have united to commend and avoid. Nor is the decision an unwise one, for man is a gregarious animal, knowing that friendship is, at best, but a feeble passion, and therefore to be treated with the care due an invalid. It is impossible to be quite candid in conversation with a man, and with a woman it is absolutely necessary that your speech should be candid. Truth, then, is the least desirable of acquaintances. But even if one wished to know the truth, the desire could scarcely be fulfilled. Francis Bacon, Lord Verulam, a prominent lawyer of Elizabeth's time, who would have written Shakespeare's plays, had his other occupations not prevented it, quotes Pilate as inquiring, "What is truth?" and then not staying for an answer. Pilate deserves all the praise he has never received. Nothing is quite true. Even truth lies at the bottom of a well, and not infrequently in other places. No assertion is one whit truer than its opposite. A mild buzz of protest rose about him. Kynaston smiled and cocked his head on one side. "We have, for example," he pointed out, "a large number of proverbs, the small coin of conversation, received everywhere, whose value no one disputes. They are rapped forth like an oath, with an air of settling the question once and forever. Well, there is safety in quotations, but even the devil can cite Shakespeare for his purpose. Never put off till tomorrow what you can do today." agrees ill with sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. And it is somewhat difficult to reconcile take care of the pence and the pounds will take care of themselves with the equally familiar penny wise, pound foolish. Yet the sayings are equally untrue. Any maxim is, perforce, a general statement, and therefore fallacious, and therefore universally accepted. Art is long, and life is short, but the platitudes concerning them are both insufferable and eternal. We must remember that a general statement is merely a snapshot at flying truth, an instantaneous photograph of a moving body. It may be the way that a thing is, but it is never the way in which any one ever saw that thing, or ever will. This is, of course, a general statement. As to present events, then, it may be assumed that no one is either capable or desirous of speaking the truth. Why, then, make such a pother about it as to the past? There we have carried the investigation of truth to such an extreme that nowadays very few of us dare believe anything. Opinions are difficult to secure when a quarter of an hour in the library will prove either side of any question. Formerly people had a few opinions which, if erroneous, were at least universal. Nero was not considered an immaculate man. The flood was currently believed to have caused the death of quite a number of persons. And George Washington, it was widely stated, once cut down a cherry tree. But now all these comfortable illusions have been destroyed by the least little men who spend their time and lose their wits in chasing nimble and retiring truth to the extreme perturbation and drying up of the moistures. Kynaston looked up for a moment, and Billy Woods, who had counted 7 wrinkles and was dropping into a forlorn doze, started violently. His interest then became abnormal. "There are," Mr. Kynaston complained, rather reproachfully, "too many inquiries, doubts, investigations, discoveries, and apologies. There are palliations of Tiberius, eulogies of Henry VIII, rehabilitations of Aaron Burr. Lucretia Borgia, it appears, was a grievously misunderstood woman, and Heliogabalus, a most exemplary monarch, and even the dog in the manger may have been a nervous animal in search of rest and quiet. As for Shakespeare, he was an atheist, a syndicate, a lawyer's clerk, an inferior writer, a Puritan, a scholar, a nom de plume, a doctor of medicine, a fool, a poacher, and another man of the same name. Information of this sort crops up on every side. Even the newspapers are infected. Truth lurks in the patent medicine advertisements, and sometimes creeps stealthily into the very editorials. We must all learn the true facts of history, whether we will or no. Eventually the writers of historical romance will not escape. So the sad tale goes. Ignorance, beautiful divine ignorance, is forsaken by a generation that clamors for the truth. The earnest-minded person has plucked Zeus out of heaven, and driven the Maenad from the wood, and dragged Poseidon out of his deep-sea palace. The conclaves of Olympus, it appears, are merely nature myths. The stately legends clustering about them turn out to be a rather elaborate method of expressing the fact that it occasionally rains. The heroes who endured their angers and jests and tragic loves are delicately veiled allusions to the sun, surely a very harmless topic of conversation even in Greece. And the monsters, Gorgons and Hydras and Chimeras, dire, their grisly offspring, their futile opponents, are but personified frosts. Mythology, the poet's necessity, the fertile mother of his inventions, has become a series of atmospheric phenomena, and the labors of Hercules prove to be a dozen weather bulletins. Is it any cause for wonder that under this cheerless influence our poetry is either silent or unsouled? The true poet must be ignorant, for information is the thief of rhyme, and it is only in dealing with— Kynaston paused. Margaret had appeared in the vestibule, and behind her stood her father, looking very grave. "We have made a most interesting discovery," Miss Hugonin airily announced to the world at large. "It appears that Uncle Fred left all his property to Mr. Woods here. We found the will only last night. I'm sure you'll all be interested to learn I'm a pauper now, and intend to support myself by plain sewing. Any work of this nature you may choose to favour me with, ladies and gentlemen, will receive my most earnest attention." She dropped a curtsy. The scene appealed to her taste for the dramatic. Billy came toward her quickly. "Peggy," he demanded of her, in the semi-privacy of the vestibule, "will you kindly elucidate the meaning of this idiotic foolishness?" "Why, this," she explained easily, and exhibited a folded paper. "I found it in the grate last night." He inspected it with large eyes. "That's absurd," he said at length. "You know perfectly well this will isn't worth the paper it's written on." "My dear sir," she informed him, coldly, "you are vastly mistaken. You see, I've burned the other one." She pushed by him. "Mr. Canaston, are you ready for our walk? We'll finish the paper some other time. Wasn't it the strangest thing in the world?" Her deep, mellow voice died away as she and Canaston disappeared in the gardens. Billy gasped. But meanwhile Colonel Hugonin had given the members of his daughter's house party some inkling as to the present posture of affairs. They were gazing at Billy Woods rather curiously. He stood in the vestibule of Selwood, staring after Margaret Hugonin, but they stared at him, and over his curly head, sculptured above the doorway, they saw the eagle, the symbol of the crude, incalculable power of wealth. Mr. Woods stood in the vestibule of his own house. 17.
"By gad," said Colonel Hugonin, very grimly, "anybody would think you'd just lost a fortune instead of inheriting one. Wish you joy of it, Billy. I ain't saying, you know, we shan't miss it, my daughter and I. No, begad, for it's a nice pot of money, and we'll miss it damnably. But since somebody had to have it, I'd much rather it was you, my boy, than a set of infernal, hypocritical, philanthropic sharks. And I'm damn glad Frederick has done the square thing by you. Yes, begad."
The old gentleman was standing beside Mr. Woods in the vestibule of Selwood, some distance from the other members of the house party, and was speaking in confidence. He was sincere. I don't say that the thought of facing the world at 65 with practically no resources save his half-pay. I think I've told you that the colonel's diversions had drunk up his wife's fortune and his own like a glass of water. I don't say that this thought moved him to hilarity. Over it, indeed, he pulled a frankly grave face. But he cared a deal for Billy, and even now there was balm, soothing, priceless balm, to be had of the reflection that this change in his prospects affected materially the prospects of those cultured, broad-minded, philanthropic persons who had aforetime set his daughter to requiring of him a perusal of Herbert Spencer. Billy was pretty well aware how monetary matters stood with the old wastrel, and the sincerity of the man affected him far more than the most disinterested sentiments would have done. Mr. Woods accordingly shook hands with entirely unnecessary violence. "You're a trump, that's what you are," he declared. "Oh, yes, you are, Colonel. You're an incorrigible, incurable old ace of trumps, the very best there is in the pack, and it's entirely useless for you to attempt to conceal it."
"Gad,"
said the Colonel. "And don't you worry about that will," Mr. Woods advised. I can't explain things just now, but it's all right. You just wait. Just wait till I've seen Peggy," Billy urged in desperation, "and I'll explain everything."
"By gad,"
said the Colonel, but Mr. Woods was halfway out of the vestibule. Mr. Woods was in an unenviable state of perturbation. He could not quite believe that Peggy had destroyed the will. The thing out-Heroded Herod, out-Margareted Margaret. But if she had, it struck him as a high-handed proceeding, entailing certain vague penalties made, and provided by the law to cover just such cases, penalties of whose nature he was entirely ignorant and didn't care to think. Heavens, for all he knew, that angel might have let herself in for a jail sentence. Billy pictured that queen among women, that paragon, with her glorious hair cropped, and her pink-tipped little hand set to beating hemp. He had a shadowy notion that the lives of all female convicts were devoted to this pursuit, and groaned in horror. "In the name of heaven," Mr. Woods demanded of his soul, "what possible reason could she have had for this new insanity? And in the name of heaven, why couldn't she have put off her tete-a-tete with Canaston long enough to explain? And in the name of heaven, what does she see to admire in that putty-faced, grimacing ass anyway? And in the name of heaven, what am I to say to this poor old man here? I can't explain that his daughter isn't in any danger of being poor, but merely being locked up in jail.
And in the name of heaven, how long does that outrageous angel expect me to remain in this state of suspense?" Billy groaned again and paced the vestibule. Then he retraced his steps, shook hands with Colonel Hugonin once more, and, canaston or no canaston, set out to find her.
End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Eagle's Shadow by James Branch Cabell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Original recording by John M. Wilson for Bureau 42, donated to LibriVox with his express permission.
18. But when he came out upon the terrace, Sarah Ellen Haggage stopped him with a queer blending of diffidence and resolve in her manner. The others, by this, had disappeared in various directions, puzzled and exceedingly uncertain what to do. Indeed, to congratulate Billy in the Colonel's presence would have been tactless, and on the other hand, to condole with the Colonel without seeming to affront the wealthy Mr. Woods was almost impossible. So they temporized and fled, all save Mrs. Haggage. She alone remained to view Mr. Woods with newly opened eyes, for as he paused impatiently, the sculptured eagle above his head, she perceived that he was a remarkably handsome and intelligent young man. Her motherly heart opened toward this lonely, wealthy orphan. "My dear Billy," she cooed, with asthmatic gentleness, "as an odd old friend of your mother's, aren't you going to let me tell you how rejoiced Adele and I are over your good fortune? It isn't polite, you naughty boy, for you to run away from your friends as soon as they've heard this wonderful news. Ah, such news it was, such a manifest intervention of Providence. My heart has been fluttering like a little bird, Billy, ever since I heard it." In testimony to this fact, Mrs. Haggage clasped a stodgy hand to an exceedingly capacious bosom, and exhibited the whites of her eyes freely. Her smile, however, remained unchanged and ample. Oh, yes, very kind of you, I'm sure," said Mr. Woods. "I never in my life saw Adele so deeply affected by anything," Mrs. Haggage continued, with a certain large archness. "The sweet child was always so fond of you, you know, Billy. I remember distinctly hearing her speak of you many and many a time when you were in that dear, delightful, wicked Paris, and wonder when you would come back to your friends. Not very grand and influential friends, Billy, but sincere, I trust, for all that." Mr. Woods said he had no doubt of it. "So many people," she informed him confidentially, "will pursue you with adulation now that you are wealthy. Oh, yes, you will find that wealth makes a great difference, Billy. But not with Adele and me. No, dear boy, despise us if you will, but my child and I are not mercenary. Money makes no difference with us. We shall be the same to you that we always were, sincerely interested in your true welfare, overjoyed at your present good fortune, prayerful as to your brilliant future, and delighted to have you drop in any evening to dinner. We do not consider money the chief blessing of life. No, don't tell me that most people are different, Billy, for I know it very well, and many is the tear that thought has cost me. We live in a very mercenary world, my dear boy, but our thoughts, at least, are set on higher things, and I trust we can afford to despise the merely temporal blessings of life. And I entreat you to remember that our humble dwelling is always open to the son of my old friend, and that there is always a jug of good whiskey in the cupboard." Thus, in the shadow of the eagle, babbled the woman whom, for all her absurdities, Margaret had loved as a mother. Billy thanked her with an angry heart. And this, I give you the gist of his meditations, this is Peggy's dearest friend. O philanthropy, are thy protestations then all void and empty, and are thy noblest sentiments, every one of 'em, so full of sound and rhetoric,
so specious, so delectable, are these then but Dicer's oaths? Aloud, I'm rather surprised, you know, he said slowly, that you take it just this way, Mrs. Haggage. I should have thought you'd have been sorry on Miss Hugonen's account. It's awfully jolly of you, of course. Oh, awfully jolly. And I appreciate it, at its true worth, I assure you. But it's a bit awkward, isn't it, that the poor girl will be practically penniless? I really don't know whom she'll turn to now. Then Billy, the diplomatist, received a surprise. She'll come with me, of course, said Mrs. Haggage. Mr. Woods made an, unfortunately, inaudible observation. I beg your pardon? She queried. Then, obtaining no response, she continued, with perfect simplicity. Margaret's quite like a daughter to me, you know. Of course, she and the Colonel will come with us, at least until affairs are a bit more settled. Even afterward, well, we have a large house, Billy, and I don't see that they'd be any better off anywhere else. Billy's emotions were complex. You big-hearted old parasite, his own heart was singing. If you could only keep that ring of truth that's in your voice for your platform utterances, why, in less than no time you could afford to feed your Afro-Americans on Nightingale's tongues and clothe every working girl in the land in cloth of gold. You've been pilfering from Peggy for years, pilfering right and left with both hands, but you've loved her all the time, God bless you. And now the moment she's in trouble, you're ready to take both her and the Colonel, whom, by the way, you must very cordially detest, and share your pitiful, pilfered little crusts with them, and, having 2 more mouths to feed, probably pilfer a little more outrageously in the future. You're a sanctimonious old hypocrite, you are, and a pious fraud, and a delusion, and a snare, and you and Adele have nefarious designs on me at this very moment, but I think I'd like to kiss you. Indeed, I believe Mr. Woods came very near doing so. She loved Peggy, you see, and he loved everyone who loved her. But he compromised by shaking hands energetically, for a matter of 5 minutes, and entreating to be allowed to subscribe to some of her deserving charitable enterprises, anyone she might mention, and so left the old lady a little bewildered, but very much pleased. She decided that for the future, Adele must not see so much of Mr. Van Orden. She began to fear that gentleman's views of life were not sufficiently serious. 19. Billy went into the gardens in pursuit of Margaret. He was almost happy now, and felt vaguely ashamed of himself. Then he came upon Kathleen Saumarez, who, indeed, was waiting for him there, and his heart went down into his boots. He realized on a sudden that he was one of the richest men in America. It was a staggering thought. Also, Mr. Woods's views at this moment as to the advantages of wealth might have been interesting. Kathleen stood silent for an instant, eyes downcast, face flushed. She was trembling. Then, Billy, she asked, almost inaudibly, Do you still want your answer? The birds sang about them. Spring triumphed into the gardens. She looked very womanly and very pretty. To all appearances, it might easily have been a lover and his lass met in the springtide, shamefaced after last night's kissing. But Billy somehow lacked much of the elation and the perfect content and the disposition to burst into melody that is currently supposed to seize upon rustic swains at such moments. He merely wanted to know if at any time in the remote future his heart would be likely to resume the discharge of its proper functions. It was standing still now. However, can you ask, dear? His words at least lied gallantly. The poor woman looked up into Billy's face. After many years of battling with the world, here for the asking was peace and luxury and wealth incalculable, and, as Kathleen thought, a love that had endured since they were boy and girl together. Yet she shrunk from him a little, and clenched her hands before she spoke. Yes, Kathleen faltered, and afterwards she shuddered. And here, if for the moment I may prefigure the eagle as a sentient being, I can imagine his chuckle. Please, God, thought poor Billy, I will make her happy. Yes, please God, I can at least do that, since she cares for me. Then he kissed her.
"My dear," said he aloud, "I'll try to make you happy. And you don't mind, do you, if I leave you now?" queried this ardent lover. "You see, it's absolutely necessary I should see Miss Hugonin about this will business. You don't mind very much, do you, darling?" Mr. Woods inquired of her, the last word being rather obviously an afterthought. "No," said she, "not if you must, dear." Billy went away, lugging a heart of lead in his breast. Kathleen stared after him and gave a hard, wringing motion of her hands. She had done what many women do daily. The thing is common and sensible and universally commended, but in her own eyes the draggled trollop of the pavements was neither better nor worse than she. At the entrance of the next walkway Billy encountered Felix Kynaston, alone, and in the most ebulliently mirthful of humours. 20. But we had left Mr. Kynaston, I think, in company with Miss Hugonin. At the precise moment she inquired of him whether it were not the strangest thing in the world, referring thereby to the sudden manner in which she had been disinherited. The poet laughed and assented. Afterward, turning north from the front court, they descended past the shield-bearing griffins, and you may depend upon it that each shield is adorned with a bas-relief of the eagle that guard the broad stairway leading to the formal gardens of Selwood. The gardens stretched northward to the confines of Peter Blagden's estate of Gridlington, and for my part, unless it were that primitive garden that Adam lost, I can imagine no goodlier place. On this particular forenoon, however, neither Miss Hugonin nor Felix Kynaston had eyes for its comeliness. Silently they braved the griffins, and in silence they skirted the fish-pond, silver crinkling in the May morning, and passed through cloistral ilex-shadowed walks, and amphitheatres of green velvet, and terraces ample and mellow in the sunlight, silently. The trees pelted them with blossoms, pedestaled in leafy recesses, satyrs grinned at them apishly, and the arrows of diverse pot-bellied cupids threatened them, and fawns piped for them ditties of no tone. The birds were about shrill avocations overhead, and everywhere the heatless, odorful air was a caress. But for all this, Miss Hugonin and Mr. Kynaston were silent and very fidgety. Margaret was hatless, and the glory of the eminently sensible spring sun appeared to centre in her hair, and violet-clad, and the gown, like most of her gowns, was all tiny tucks and frills and flounces, diapered with semi-transparencies, unsubstantial, foam-like, mere violet froth. As she came starry-eyed through the gardens, the impudent wind trifling with her hair, I protest she might have been some lady of Oberon's court, stolen out of Elfland to bedevil us poor mortals, with only a moonbeam for the changeable heart of her, and for raiment a violent shadow spirited from the underside of some big fleecy cloud. They came presently through a trim, yew-hedged walkway to a summer-house, covered with vines, into which Margaret peeped and declined to enter, on the ground that it was entirely too chilly and gloomy and exactly like a mausoleum. But nearby they found a semicircular marble bench, about which a group of elm trees made a pleasant shadow, splashed at just the proper intervals with sunlight. On this Margaret seated herself, and then pensively moved to the other end of the bench, because a slanting sunbeam fell there. Since it was absolutely necessary to blast Mr. Kynaston's dearest hopes, she thoughtfully endeavoured to distract his attention from his own miseries, as far as might be possible, by showing him how exactly like an aureole her hair was in the sunlight. Margaret always had a kind heart. Kynaston stood before her, smiling a little. He was the sort of man to appreciate the manoeuvre. "My lady," he asked very softly, "haven't you any good news for me on this wonderful morning?" "Excellent news," Margaret assented, with a cheerfulness that was not utterly free from trepidation. "I've decided not to marry you, beautiful, and I trust you're properly grateful. You see, you're very nice, of course, but I'm going to marry somebody else, and bigamy is a crime, you know. And anyhow, I'm only a pauper, and you'd never be able to put up with my temper. Now, beautiful, I'm quite sure you couldn't, so there's not a bit of use in arguing it. Some day you'd end by strangling me, which would be horribly disagreeable for me, and then they'd hang you for it, you know, and that would be equally disagreeable for you. Fancy, though, what a good advertisement it would be for your poems. She was not looking at him now. Oh no, Margaret was far too busily employed getting the will, which she had carried all this time, into an absurd little silver chain bag hanging at her waist. She had no time to look at Felix Kynaston. There was such scant room in the bag, her purse took up so much space, there was scarcely any left for the folded paper. The affair really required her closest, undivided attention. Besides, she had not the least desire to look at Kynaston just now. "Beautiful child," he pleaded, "look at me." But she didn't. She felt that at that moment she could have looked at a Gorgon, say, or a cockatrice, or any other trifle of that nature with infinitely greater composure. The pause that followed Margaret accordingly devoted to a scrutiny of his shoes, and sincere regret that their owner was not a mercenary man who would be glad to be rid of her. "Beautiful child," spoke the poet's voice sadly, surely you aren't saying this in mistaken kindness to me? Surely you aren't saying this because of what has happened in regard to your money affairs? Believe me, my dear, that makes no difference to me. It is you I love, you, the woman of my heart, and not a certain and doubtless desirable amount of metal discs and dirty paper. Now I suppose you're going to be very noble and very nasty about it," observed Miss Hugonin, resentfully. "That's my main objection to you, you know, that you haven't any faults I can recognize and feel familiar and friendly with." "My dear," he protested, "I assure you I am not intentionally disagreeable." At that she raised velvet eyes to him, with a visible effort though, and smiled. "I know you far too well to think that," she said wistfully. "I know I'm not worthy of you. I am tremendously fond of you, beautiful, but you see I love somebody else," Margaret concluded, with admirable candor. "Ah," said he, in a rather curious voice. "The painter chap, eh?" Then Margaret's face flamed, in a wonderful glow of shame and happiness and pride that must have made the surrounding roses very hopelessly jealous. A quaint mothering look, sacred, divine, Madonna-like, woke in her great eyes as she thought, remorsefully, of how unhappy Billy must be at that very moment, and of how big he was and of his general niceness, and she desired very heartily that this fleshy young man would make his scene and have done with it. Who was he, forsooth, to keep her from Billy? She wished she had never heard of Felix Kynaston. Son vent femme varie, my brothers. However, yes, said Margaret. "You are a dear," said Mr. Kynaston, with conviction in his voice. I dare say Margaret was surprised, but the poet had taken her hand and had kissed it reverently, and then sat down beside her, twisting one foot under him in a fashion he had. He was frankly grateful to her for refusing him, and the mask of affectation slipped. She saw in him another man. "I am an out-and-out fraud," he confessed with the gayest of smiles. "I am not in love with you, and I am inexpressibly glad that you are not in love with me. Oh, Margaret, Margaret! You don't mind if I call you that, do you? I shall have to in any event, because I like you so tremendously now that we are not going to be married. You have no idea what a night I spent. I consider it most peculiar and unsympathetic of my hair not to have turned gray. I thought you were going to have me, you see." Margaret was far too much astonished to be angry. "But last night," she presently echoed in candid surprise. "Why, last night you didn't know I was poor." He wagged a protesting forefinger. "That made no earthly difference," he assured her. "Of course it was the money, and in some degree the moon, that induced me to make love to you. I acted on the impulse of the moment. Just for an instant, the novelty of doing a perfectly sensible thing, and marrying money is universally conceded to come under that head, appealed to me. So I did it. But all the time I was in love with Kathleen Saumarez. Why, the moment I left you I began to realize that not even you, and you are quite the most fascinating and generally adorable woman I ever knew, Margaret, I began to realize, I say, that not even you could ever make me forget that fact. And I was very properly miserable. It is extremely queer," Mr. Kynaston continued after an interval of meditation, "but falling in love appears to be the one utterly inexplicable, utterly reasonless thing one ever does in one's life. You can usually think of some more or less plausible palliation for embezzlement, say, or for robbing a cathedral, or even for committing suicide. But no man can ever explain how he happened to fall in love. He simply did it. Margaret nodded sagely. She knew. Now you, Mr. Kynaston was pleased to say, are infinitely more beautiful, younger, more clever, and in every way more attractive than Kathleen. I recognize these things clearly, but it does not appear somehow to alter the fact that I'm in love with her. I think I have been in love with her all my life. We were boy and girl together, Margaret, and I give you my word, Kynaston cried with his boyish flush. I worship her. I simply cannot explain the perfectly unreasonable way in which I worship her. He was sincere. He loved Kathleen Saumarez as much as he was capable of loving anyone, almost as much as he loved to dilate on his own peculiarities and emotions. Margaret's gaze was intent upon him. Yet, she marveled, you made love to me very tropically. With unconcealed pride, Mr. Kynaston assented. Didn't I? He said. I was in rather good form last night, I thought. And you were actually prepared to marry me? She asked. Even after you knew I was poor? I couldn't very well back out, he submitted, and then cocked his head on one side. You see, he added whimsically, I was sufficiently a conceited ass to fancy you cared a little for me. So of course I was going to marry you and try to make you happy, but how dear, oh, how unutterably dear it was of you, Margaret, to decline to be made happy in any such fashion. And Mr. Kynaston paused to chuckle, and to regard her with genuine esteem and affection. But still her candid eyes weighed him, and transparently found him wanting. You are thinking, perhaps, what an unutterable cad I have been? He suggested. Yes, you are rather by way of being a cad, beautiful. But I can't help liking you somehow. I dare say it's because you're honest with me. Nobody, Miss Hugonna lamented, a forlorn little quiver in her voice, ever seemed to be honest with me except you. And now I know you weren't. Oh, beautiful, aren't I ever to have any real friends? She pleaded wistfully. Kynaston had meant a deal to her, you see. He had been the one man she trusted. She had gloried in his fustian rhetoric, his glib artlessness, his airy scorn of money, and now all this proved mere pinchbeck. On a sudden, too, there woke in some by-corner of her heart a queasy realization of how near she had come to loving Kynaston. The thought nauseated her. My dear, he answered kindly, you will have any number of friends, now that you are poor. It was merely your money that kept you from having any. You see, Mr. Kynaston went on, with somewhat the air of one climbing upon his favorite hobby, money is the only thing that counts nowadays. In America, the rich are necessarily our only aristocracy. It is quite natural. One cannot hope for an aristocracy of intellect, if only for the reason that 1 person in 1,000 has any. And birth does not count for much. Of course, it is quite true that all of our remote ancestors came over with William the Conqueror. I have sometimes thought that the number of steerage passengers his ships would accommodate must have been little short of marvelous. But it is equally true that the grandfathers of most of our leisure class were either deserving or dishonest persons, who either started life on a farm and studied Euclid by the firelight and did all the other priggish things they thought would look well in a biography, or else met with marked success in embezzlement. So money, after all, is our only standard, and when a woman is as rich as you were yesterday, she cannot hope for friends any more than the Queen of England can. You could have plenty of flatterers, toadies, sycophants, anything in fine, but friends. I don't believe it, said Margaret, half angrily. Not a word of it. There must be some honest people in the world who don't consider that money is everything. You know there must be, beautiful. The poet laughed. That, said he, affably, is poppycock. You're repeating the sort of thing I said to you yesterday. I am honest now. The best of us, Margaret, cannot help being impressed by the power of money. It is the greatest power in the world, and we cannot possibly look upon rich people as being quite like us. We must toady to them a bit, Margaret, whether we want to or not. The eagle intimidates us all. I hate him, Miss Hugonin announced, with vehemence. Canaston searched his pockets. After a moment he produced a $1 bill and showed her the eagle on it. There, he said gravely, is the original of the Woods Eagle. The eagle that intimidates us all. Do you remember that Shakespeare? One always harks back to Shakespeare to clinch an argument, because not even our foremost actors have been able to conceal the fact that he was, as somebody in Dickens acutely points out, a devilish clever fellow. Do you remember, I say, what Shakespeare observes as to this very eagle? Miss Hugonin shook her little head, till it glittered in the sunlight like a topaz. She cared no more for Shakespeare than the average woman does, and she was never quite comfortable when he was alluded to. He says, Mr. Canaston quoted solemnly, "The eagle suffers little birds to sing, and is not careful what they mean thereby, knowing that with the shadow of his wing he can at pleasure still their melody." "That's nonsense," said Margaret calmly. "I haven't the least idea what you're talking about, and I don't believe you have either." He waved the $1 bill with a heroic gesture. "Here," he asserted, "is the eagle, and by the little birds I have not a doubt he meant charity, and independence, and kindliness, and truth, and the rest of the standard virtues. That is quite as plausible as the interpretation of the average commentator. The presence of money chills these little birds. It is lamentable, no doubt, but it is true." "I don't believe it," said Margaret, quite as if that settled the question. But now his hobby, rowelled by opposition, was spurred to loftier flights. "Ah, the power of these great fortunes America has bred is monstrous," he suddenly cried. "And always they work for evil. If I were ever to write a melodrama, Margaret, I could wish for no more thorough-paced villain than a large fortune." Canaston paused and laughed grimly. "We cringe to the eagle," said he. "Ah, well, why not? The eagle is very powerful and very cruel. In the south yonder, the eagle has penned over 1,000,000 children in his factories, where day by day he drains the youth and health and very life out of their tired bodies. In sweatshops, men and women are toiling for the eagle, giving their lives for the pittance that he grudges them. In countless mines and mills, the eagle is trading human lives for coal and flour. In Wall Street yonder, the eagle is juggling as he will with life's necessities, thieving from the farmer, thieving from the consumer, thieving from the poor fools who try to play the eagle's game, and driving them at will to despair and ruin and death. Look whither you may, men die that the eagle may grow fat. So the eagle thrives, and daily the rich grow richer and the poor grow poorer in the end." Canaston paused, staring into vacancy. "Ah, well," said he, with a smile and a snap of his fingers, "the end rests upon the knees of the gods. But there must need be an end some day. And meanwhile you cannot blame us if we cringe to the eagle that is master of the world. It is human nature to cringe to its master, and while human nature is not always an admirable thing, it is, I believe, rather widely distributed." Margaret did not return the smile. Like any sensible woman, she never tolerated opinions that differed from her own. So she waved his preachment aside. "You're trying to be eloquent," was her observation, "and you've only succeeded in being very silly and tiresome. Go away, beautiful. You make me awfully tired, and I don't care for you in the least. Go and talk to Kathleen. I shall be here, on this very spot," Margaret added with commendable precision and an unaccountable increase of colour, if any one should happen to ask." Then Canaston rose and laughed merrily. "You are quite delicious," he commented. "It will always be a grief and a puzzle to me that I am not mad for love of you. It is unreasonable of me," he complained sadly and shook his head, "but I prefer Kathleen, and I am quite certain that somebody will ask where you are. I shall describe to him the exact spot." Mr. Canaston paused, with a slight air of apology. "If I were you," he suggested pleasantly, "I would move a little, just a little, to the left. That will enable you to obtain to a fuller extent the benefit of the sunbeam which is falling, quite by accident, of course, upon your hair. You are perfectly right, Margaret, in selecting that hedge as a background. Its sombre green sets you off to perfection." He went away chuckling. He felt that Margaret must think him a devil of a fellow. She didn't, though. The idea of his suspecting me of such unconscionable vanity, she said, properly offended. And then, anyhow, a man has no business to know about such things, she continued with rising indignation. I believe Felix Kynaston is as good a judge of chiffons as any woman. That's effeminate, I think, and catty, and absurd. I don't believe I ever liked him, not really, that is. Now, what would Billy care about sunbeams and backgrounds, I'd like to know? He'd never even notice them. Billy is a man. Why, that's just what Father said yesterday, Margaret cried, and afterward laughed happily. I suppose old people are right sometimes, but dear, dear, they're terribly unreasonable at others. Having thus uttered the ancient, undying plaint of youth, Miss Hugonin moved a matter of 2 inches to the left, and smiled, and waited contentedly. It was barely possible some one might come that way, and it is always a comfort to know that one is not exactly repulsive in appearance. Also, there was the spring about her, and chief of all, there was a queer fluttering in her heart that was yet not unpleasant. In fine, she was unreasonably happy for no reason at all. I believe the foolish poets call this feeling love, and swear it is divine. However, they will say anything for the sake of an ear-tickling jingle, and while it is true that scientists have any number of plausible and interesting explanations for this same feeling, I am sorry to say I have forgotten them. I am compelled then to fall back upon those same unreliable, irresponsible rhymesters, and to insist with them that a maid waiting in the springtide for the man she loves is necessarily happy, and very rarely puzzles her head over the scientific reason for it. 21. But 10 minutes later she saw Mr. Woods in the distance, striding across the sunlit terraces, and was seized with the conviction that their interview is likely to prove a stormy one. There was an ominous stiffness in his gait. "Oh, dear, dear," Miss Hugonin wailed. "He's in a temper now, and he'll probably be just as disagreeable as it's possible for anyone to be. I do wish men weren't so unreasonable. He looks exactly like a big, blue-eyed thundercloud just now. Just now, when I'm sure he has every cause in the world to be very much pleased. After all I've done for him, he makes me awfully tired. I think he's very ungrateful. I think I'm rather afraid." In fact, she was. Now that the meeting she had anticipated these 12 hours past was actually at hand, there woke in her breast an unreasoning panic. Miss Hugonin considered, and caught up her skirts, and whisked into the summer-house, and there sat down in the darkest corner and devoutly wished Mr. Woods in Crim Tartary, or Jericho, or, in a word, any region other than the gardens of Selwood. Billy came presently to the opening in the hedge and stared at the deserted bench. He was undeniably in a temper. But then how becoming it was, thought someone. "Miss Hugonin," he said coldly. Evidently, thought someone, he intends to be just as nasty as possible. "Peggy," said Mr. Woods after a little. "Perhaps," thought someone, "he won't be very nasty." "Dear Peggy," said Mr. Woods, in his most conciliatory tone. Someone rearranged her hair complacently, but there was no answer, save the irresponsible chattering of the birds, and with a sigh Billy turned upon his heel. And then, by the oddest chance in the world, Margaret coughed. I dare say it was damp in the summer-house, or perhaps it was caused by some passing bronchial irritation, or perhaps, incredible as it may seem, she coughed to show him where she was. But I scarcely think so, because Margaret insisted afterward, very positively too, that she didn't cough at all.
End of chapter 21.